Well, hello there, and welcome to our first anatomy session. And today we're going to study the muscles of the torso. So let's jump into it. So I usually start with the head, and then I draw the center line or the gesture line, which very often are the same thing. I simultaneously keep track of the proportions already, because if stuff is off at the core of the construction, everything is gonna fall apart at the end. And the same goes for the ribcage and the pelvis. I always keep track of the proportions, especially at the beginning. So I draw the scapulae, or in this case, just the one scapula, because we see just the one side. And then I add in the deltoids, the infraspinatus, and the teres major. The teres major is kind of stretching, I feel, because the hand is kind of reaching forward and it's resting on his knee. Then I draw in the lats. And then I draw the abs. I feel that with abs it might be kind of difficult to avoid this kind of monotonous feel because, especially me, I tend to draw them, unfortunately, kind of looking very repetitive. Then I also draw in the trapezius, and with the trapezius I feel like the top portion is bulging out a bit because his shoulders are kind of like moving upward a little bit. So with the second pose, I begin with the head again, and I also draw the hair because it visually kind of enlarges the head. So I just want to make sure that I will not get things confused when I'm like measuring in the future. With the foreshortened poses, it's really important to lay in the rib cage and the pelvis because it really helps to visualize how the forms are turning in space when you actually put down the forms on the paper and not just a 2D gesture line. One of her shoulders is really pushing upward, so I'm trying to capture that. And I also, after I find the deltoids and the teres majors and the infraspinatus, I draw in the tendinous triangular section around the seventh cervical for the traps attachment. And then I also draw the pieces because that's where the lats attach to. So with this pose, again, I start with the head, I draw the hair, and I apply gesture to her arms and hands as well. Then I put lines to mark the edges of the pose proportionally. And I also try to keep in mind the thickness of forms while I'm drawing them. A good way to check the thickness of the forms is just to compare, for example, the thickness of the legs with the thickness of the arms. If the thickness of these forms is not as different in the reference as it is on your drawing, then you know you have something to fix. Also, another good way to check the proportions is to look at the negative space in your drawing. Also, I have a little tip. Don't make lines thick right off the bat. It's just gonna snowball into you having a billion very thick lines that don't really have a purpose anymore. So it's better to just start with very thin, very light lines. And then once you put everything down, then you can start organizing your lines and putting on the weight. So this fourth pose is very gestural, and a lot of that gesture is coming from the arms because they're kind of pushing into her ribcage and they're kind of like twisting forward. So I'm putting a lot of energy into these arms. And again, I'm also putting the gesture into her hands and into her fingers as well, especially with this pose because I feel like it's an essential part to really capture the gesture in here. I'm trying for everything, even when I begin drawing the muscles or the bones, anything. I'm trying for everything to fall into the overall rhythm of the pose. It is something that I've started to think about just recently, but it really helps because this is how you avoid the final product looking like the muscles are just kind of slapped on top of a bending form in a way. It's because if the pose has a gesture, you can't stop thinking about the gesture just because you're now slapping muscles on top of the ribcage or the pelvis or whatever. You have to be aware of the rhythm that the pose has throughout the whole drawing. You can't just think of the muscles as like static marshmallows that just grow out of the forms that you've put down before on the paper. You can't be thinking about it that way. Then I add in the deltoids. And since this is a pose that shows the front, I didn't have the chance to practice the teres major or the infraspinatus or any of these shoulder muscles, but I did draw the pecs. Then I also extend the center line and I also put in the navel. So that would be everything for today. I hope that you liked it. If you did, definitely subscribe and leave a like. Comment down below if you have any thoughts. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye!